on its own technological field there, or?
Oh, yeah, it's not that bad. Well, good evening, everybody. Glad to have so many with us online. And as we get started here in just a minute, we'll have David lead us in a song, and then we'll get going. We are going to be starting with the book of Isaiah this evening. Are there any urgent announcements or prayer requests, though, before we get going?
Just for Leslie and her family.
We need to remember the Matt Miller family and the Shepherds as well, as they deal with the losses. Okay. David, you want to go ahead and come up and lead us in song? Please turn to number 505. Number 505. Glorify thy name. Five, 505. Father, we love you, we worship and adore you. Glorify thy name in all the earth. Glorify thy name. Glorify thy name. Glorify thy name in all the earth. Jesus, we love you, we worship and adore you. Glorify thy name in all the earth. Glorify thy name. Glorify thy name. Glorify thy name in all the earth. Spirit, we love you, we worship and adore you. Glorify thy name in all the earth. Glorify thy name. Glorify thy name. Glorify thy name in all the earth. Good bow with me, please. Our Lord and Father, we are grateful for the opportunity to gather here and to glorify your name as we have just sung, and to study from your word and better understand these texts that you've given to us. And we pray, Father, that you'll help us as we strive to be better students each and every day, as we strive to let your light shine and your message go forth into this community through the interactions that we have each day and the people that we need. And we ask that you'll continue to be with those who are on the prayer list, especially the Mac Miller family, as they suffer from the loss of Betty, and for the Shepherd family of the loss of David, and we ask your comfort be upon them and continue to watch over them, Lord. Please go with us now in Christ's name. All right, so as we turn our attention to the book of Isaiah tonight, we did some basic introductory work on the prophets in general last week, you may recall. And it is important that we understand, again, the work of the prophets, because while Isaiah does contain the most references in our New Testament, aside from the Psalms, it's that title outright, but Isaiah is the second most quoted book in our Old Testament when it comes to New Testament quotations and references. It's easy to think of Isaiah as being only a book of foretelling, and it's not. In fact, the vast majority of Isaiah is not dealing with things that are going to happen in the future. In fact, the majority of the time is spent trying to warn God's people about what God is going to bring upon them if they don't fix their current trajectory. Isaiah began working in roughly 740 BC, which is about, the northern kingdom fell in about 725. So he's working about 15 years before Assyria conquers the northern kingdom. And he does speak to that. At this point in the history of the northern kingdom, it had already all but been decided that they were going to fall by God. And so Isaiah doesn't necessarily spend a lot of time trying to convince Israel to turn around. It's more of a warning of this is what's coming. However, he does spend a lot of time trying to convince Judah to try to turn themselves around. To that effect, he does work with two different kings of Judah, Uzziah and Hezekiah, and of course, very close with Hezekiah. So we do see him having access to even the king. He was not necessarily a prophet of the king, so to speak, but he wasn't just amongst the people either. Isaiah was contemporary with Micah, Amos, and Hosea, and if you look at the messages of those books, there's a lot of similarities to the messages of those books, because of course they're written about the same time frame, and have God's trying to get the message out through those various prophets. So we also have kind of a historical section. Isaiah is not a historical book. That is, it's not necessarily talking about what happened at a certain time, but we do have kind of a historical section of this book that is kind of Isaiah's account of the events surrounding Hezekiah and his preparing the city for the Assyrians, and also the prolonging of his life, and that's in chapters 36 through 39. And that kind of creates like kind of like an interlude to the prophecies. So the first half of the book, chapters 1 through 39, or 1 through 36, 35 if you want to be, I guess, super technical, is dealing with the salvation of physical Israel. That's where Isaiah spends the majority of his time talking about what's potentially going to happen, whether it be at the hands of the Assyrians or later the Babylonians. But he's talking about God sending his people into exile. He's talking about the warnings of God about their behaviors and what that's going to result in. Of course, when he speaks to the northern kingdom, it's pretty definitive. When he speaks to the southern kingdom, it's hopefully a word of warning is the idea. And then we have that little interlude speaking of Hezekiah and those types of things. And then chapters 40 through 66 of the book represent Isaiah's focus on the salvation of spiritual Israel. Now again, yes, there are a lot of messianic passages, especially in these chapters. But even those first, really chapters 40 through 48 are almost exclusively dealing with Isaiah's current day Israel. In fact, chapters 41 through 48 depict a kind of an ideological battle between Yahweh and idolatry. It's Isaiah pitting the two against each other to try to show Israel, to try to show Judah, kind of how ridiculous idolatry really is. I would say the heaviest messianic section, although it's not entirely devoid of messianic references in those chapters, but definitely the heaviest messianic section is chapters 49 through 56, where it refers to the Lord's servant. We often focus, I think, a lot on chapter 53, and not rightfully so, as chapter 53, of course, has that depiction of the death of Christ, but that's not the only chapter where the servant is mentioned, and things that come from this book become very important. But as we think about Isaiah as a prophet himself, not just the book that he wrote, Isaiah, the name Isaiah means the salvation of Yah, or Yah saves. We're told that he was the son of Amoz. We're told that his wife was also a prophetess. And he had two sons. And both of them, as with most of the prophets, the writing prophets anyways, their children's names are kind of part of their prophecies. So his first son, Shear-Jashub, means a remnant shall return. He's there, of course, prophesying about the captivity and the fact that God is going to preserve at least a portion of Israel. And then we have Maler-Halal-Hashbaz. Maler-Halal-Hashbaz. Say that 5 times fast, right? The spoil speeds the prey hastens. I cannot read or speak tonight, apparently. And again, that is speaking of the coming captivity, essentially meaning that there's not really anything that Israel can do to stop the oncoming storm of Assyria, but it's coming. Isaiah not only deals with Israel, but there are also, especially in those first 38 chapters or so, there are also appeals to all nations. There are even references to other nations besides Israel. Because remember, God uses Assyria and then later Babylon, not just to punish Israel, but to also punish some of those nations around Israel that were deserving of punishment because of their treatment of Israel. And these would include nations like Ammon, Moab, and others. And so there are also some references to other nations made by Isaiah, but he's not what we would consider a prophet to those nations. He's a prophet to Israel with some extra references. But again, his primary job is a reformer. He is trying to convince Israel to give up idolatry and return to God, as well as to give them hope that even though, at least for the northern kingdom, captivity is inevitable, God is still going to see them through that, and he is still going to, and more than that, he's going to bring them out of that and give them restoration. Okay, so Isaiah, as far as the book itself goes, it's the most chapters outside of the book of Psalms at 66, although by actual length of writing, pages, however you want to describe that, Jeremiah is actually a little bit longer. Jeremiah just didn't get broken up into as many chapters. There are some claims to Isaiah not being written in roughly 700 BC, but there are no real evidences to that. Usually it's just done by people who want to try to deny the prophetic nature of Isaiah. However, we do have a complete copy of Isaiah as part of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it's one of the pieces that dates older. So if you're not familiar with the Dead Sea Scrolls, some of the things found there date anywhere from 3rd century BC to 1st century AD, and Isaiah is previous to that. It's one of the earlier things that they've dated. And realistically, if Isaiah was not written until 100 years before Christ, it's still just as incredible as if it was written 700 years. So it really doesn't affect the power of it. It's just a way for liberal scholarship to try to discredit the Bible as a whole. But New Testament writers, there are, again, far too many references to Isaiah to try to give a reasonable list here. But across all parts of the book of Isaiah, there are quotes and references made in the New Testament, and they all reference them as being written by Isaiah. So as far as biblical scholarship is concerned, I personally don't need any other evidence. If God himself says Isaiah wrote the book, then Isaiah wrote the book. So the only other thing really I think that is important to understand about Isaiah from a literary approach point of view, I guess, is that Isaiah is not chronological. It seems to have been written for emphasis, or I should say compiled for emphasis. For example, chapter 1 opens with a view of the post-captivity effects to Israel. And so obviously, considering he's prophesying, trying to convince them to turn away from God before it's too late, chapter 1 opening with the devastation of captivity is not chronological. And this is common, actually, in the Old Testament, and again, especially for prophetic books, because it wasn't really an emphasis to try to put things in some sort of chronological order. The point was for God's message to be delivered, and arranging it maybe outside of chronological order was done for emphasis. Like I said, the book breaks down into two relatively easy sections. The state of physical Israel, chapters 1 through 39, and then the state of spiritual Israel, chapter 40 through the end of the book. But Isaiah, again, just based on the sheer number of quotations in the New Testament, it's an important book, but it's not necessarily more important than the other prophetic books. But it certainly gets kind of a lot of focus, especially from writers in the Christian era, just because of how often it is quoted and how many messianic prophecies it does contain. And I will admit that probably, aside from the book of Revelation, I probably have more books on Isaiah than I do any other book as far as what makes up my library. But some of that's just because it's easier to find. Not necessarily because I think it's more important. But Isaiah is kind of one of those books that I think trying to determine, a key verse or anything like that is well, number one, it's just very, very big. So a key verse for something this large just doesn't really make sense. And there are so many passages that have importance, whether it be, in Isaiah chapter 7 and the virgin birth being referenced, or the suffering servant, Isaiah chapter 53, all of those would be obviously very important, but I don't know that there's really a key verse or key verses to this book. Probably the only other thing that I feel the need to mention when it comes to Isaiah, and this kind of again goes back to all prophetic books, is that they cannot necessarily be approached purely literally. That is, remember these, even as it says, chapter 1, verse 1, the vision of Isaiah concerning the son of Amos concerning Judah and Jerusalem. It's a vision. It's not intended to be, a play-by-play. It's not an instant replay of exactly how things happened or are going to happen. Rather, it is God trying to give this often exceptionally visually overwhelming picture of something. And so, there are places where obviously, we can take something at face value, but we do need to understand that with all prophecies, and especially those that fall into the realm of visions or night visions, that these things weren't literally happening. They were just being shown to Isaiah. I guess something similar, for example, when Peter in the New Testament is praying on the rooftop before going to Cornelius, he gets a vision of a sheep coming down from heaven with animals on it. That didn't really happen, okay? And if we can understand that that didn't physically, literally happen, then we need to apply the same thing here with Isaiah and have an understanding that these things didn't necessarily physically really happen that Isaiah saw, but rather they were just, these visions, they were kind of emphatic things so that Isaiah could then, given his ability, try to portray those things in writing and speech to Israel. And again, this is one of the reasons I believe that God so often uses such vivid and powerful imagery, is to give the person receiving the vision, whether you're talking about Isaiah or Daniel or Ezekiel or John in the New Testament, or for that matter, Peter, as I just mentioned, often words probably don't do justice to what they receive in these visions, and so they have to try to make do with what language is available to them. And so I think that's why so many of these visions are so powerful. For example, Isaiah chapter 6, which is Isaiah's throne room scene. He's brought to this place by seeing the throne of God and by seeing these heavenly beings flying over the throne. And he says there in verse 5, "Woe is me, for I am ruined, or I am undone." Literally, I'm dead. I've seen God. I should die right now. And then it says in verse 6 that a seraphim flew with a burning coal and with tongs, and he touched his mouth. Obviously, an angel didn't literally take a coal from the throne of God and literally touch Isaiah's lips. It didn't happen. And Isaiah didn't literally see God for that, because if he had, he would have died. So, again, these are just, Isaiah trying to give us a picture of what he saw as best he could. But again, we have to be careful when we try to push any language from a vision too literally. This is probably the number one problem with all in prophetic interpretation, is that people want to try to apply everything 100% literal, and that's never how a vision was ever supposed to be interpreted. Never how it was ever supposed to be seen or applied. And again, if we can agree that an angel didn't actually touch Isaiah's lips with a coal, okay, well then we can agree that none of these other things actually literally happened. And that's, again, very important for our understanding of all prophetic books. All right, are there any questions or comments when it comes to Isaiah? Again, we're just trying to scratch the surface. We're not trying to get super deep, and Isaiah is one of those books that we could certainly go off the deep end with. But it's also, for one of the prophetic books, I would say Isaiah, with the exception of its length, is pretty easy to handle. There's not a lot in Isaiah that's going to, I think, give the average Bible student too much trouble. I'm not saying it's all easily understood necessarily, but there are certainly other books in our Bibles that are much more difficult to approach, especially from a prophecy standpoint. Okay, and let's go ahead and move over to Jeremiah. Okay, so first off with Jeremiah, it's maybe one of the most narrative of all the prophetic books. That is, a lot of Jeremiah contains excerpts from his life and his dealing with the various kings. It's also important to note that when we turn the page from Isaiah chapter 6 to Jeremiah chapter 1, we are moving forward in time roughly 120 years. So while Isaiah is prophesying about the time of the fall of the northern kingdom, Jeremiah's primary concern is preaching to the kings and nobles of Jerusalem as Jerusalem is about to fall. And so again, it's important that we kind of have some basis for these things, again, because we're going to go back and forth in time here throughout the prophets, and so we need to understand that they're not necessarily in chronological order, and they're not necessarily even really close to each other sometimes in their time frames. Because, of course, 120 years would mean that, for example, Jeremiah is preaching to not just different kings, but realistically, entirely different generations than what Isaiah was preaching to. So, Jeremiah, the name means Jehovah establishes, or Yah establishes. And again, some of the names of the prophets, fit very well with their message. He's described as having an uncontrollable urge to preach by himself. He says that, not unlike what Paul describes in the New Testament, where he says the message, the power, the love of Christ compelled him. He could not stop. Jeremiah had a very difficult ministry. Again, he's, as we look at chapter 1 and verse 10, for example, if somebody doesn't mind reading that for us.
See, I have appointed you this day over the nations and over the kingdom, to pluck up and to break down, to destroy and to overthrow, to build and to plant.
Largely, his message was a negative one. Isaiah had quite a bit on, I guess, the positive side, although obviously even his message was, the positive part of his message was still going to be coming from the other side of captivity. Most of Jeremiah's time is spent prophesying the downfall of Israel, the downfall of Jerusalem, the downfall of God's people, and them going into Babylonian captivity and being essentially removed from their homes and from God to an extent. That's not to say he was completely negative, but again, mostly. He was a prophet to the kings, not always well received. He often received backlash and even imprisonment. He was thrown at one point into a cistern, which is essentially a underground water storage tank. He was thrown into one with nothing to eat but bread and water that was snuck to him. The king didn't even order him to be fed, but the food was snuck to him by one of the guards that believed in Jeremiah and his message. And so, he had a very difficult message, and he also had a very difficult life. And we see both of these coming through in his message. Again, contains probably more narrative than most of the other prophets. Jeremiah is not as well known as Ezekiel for his physical prophecies. That is, Ezekiel's prophecies often involved him doing a lot of physical things. He often, we'll talk about Ezekiel more in detail, but Jeremiah also did some things in this way. It's not necessarily for him to have to do always, but for example, there's the potter. Jeremiah was told to go and watch a potter and receive the message based on that. There is a prophecy around wearing a wooden yoke in public. Hiding stones in the dirt. Again, a lot of these things, even throwing, having a scroll written and then being thrown into the Euphrates River in captivity. So again, Jeremiah not only was tasked with preaching, but also sometimes doing these physical things or using visuals in his preaching. He prophesied roughly for 40 years. Interestingly, Jeremiah is one of the only prophets that we actually have a command in the writing. He's commanded to have these things written down. Some of them would be written by Baruch, who was his scribe, his assistant, if you will. Other things will be written by Jeremiah himself. It really doesn't matter because the words themselves came from God, so it's not necessarily important who wrote what sections, but it does say in the book that both were tasked at times with writing. Again, Jeremiah is not chronological. And again, and I'm gonna mention the fact that there are people who claim that Jeremiah or that each prophet didn't write their book, but there's nothing to it. But we do need to understand that there are people out there that deny that this book was written by Jeremiah. But again, most of the time it's because they made up some sort of criteria that has no basis in any actual reality regarding the book. But there are some detractors, I guess, if you will, in regards to the authorship. But again, I've never seen anything that even remotely comes close to an actual, verifiable or even thought-inducing denial. Often it's just people who want to deny the authenticity of the Bible as a whole, and so they just try to poke holes in everything that they can. Not unlike the kings of Judah that Jeremiah was working with, who did everything they could, including imprison him, taking a knife to the word of God, all of these things trying to, again, deny the authority of God. They literally did it to Jeremiah, so I don't see, it's not surprising to me that they do it to his work. But obviously linked to Jeremiah is the book of Lamentations. And Lamentations is a song. And it is the song Jeremiah writes as he looks at the destruction, both impending and then the aftermath of what happened to Jerusalem and what happened to Israel. And I think Lamentations is a great example of how difficult of a work Jeremiah was given. Remember, he is of a high enough social class that he's accepted by not just a king, but multiple kings through this kind of downfall era leading up to the Babylonian capture and destruction of Jerusalem. And so, he's of this higher social class. He's from near Jerusalem. He's not necessarily from Jerusalem, but close enough, we would say. And so, again, his major task and prophecy is to tell the people, many of whom wanted to deny that God would allow Jerusalem to fall, many who wanted to deny that God would hold them accountable for their actions realistically. And for the most part, his task was to try to warn them, be abused for trying to warn them, and then having to watch as Babylon comes in and through a series of 3 different captivities and 3 different phases, essentially, as Babylon, again, routs and guts the city in stages, essentially, across about a roughly 20-year period. And all the while trying to tell the kings, each of these successive kings, just God's going to have this happen, just kind of go with it, and each king seemingly denying that and trying to lead various rebellions and things of that nature. But yeah, so I would encourage, if you do a read through or a study of Jeremiah, I know it's the very next book, but Lamentations offers a lot of, I think, insight into Jeremiah itself, because it tells us a lot about the heart of the man, a lot about who he was, and how he felt about what was going on. Probably more insight into how these things affected Jeremiah than we even see in the book itself, the prophecy proper, if you will, because it is an outpouring of his heart. But yeah, it's Jeremiah is kind of a sad book. Again, there are glimmers of hope, and again we see some familiar themes, things like the remnant, and of course Jeremiah chapter 31 is the prophecy of the coming covenant. So Jeremiah is not tasked solely with having a negative message, but again, a not well received, largely negative message. All right. Any questions or comments about Jeremiah? Again, remember that it's prophecy, so not everything should be taken 100% literal. But again, I think Jeremiah, aside from being super long, compared to the rest of the Bible, relatively easy to digest. And Jeremiah also contains those sections, not unlike Isaiah, where not only is he foretelling the downfall of Israel, but also the fact that Babylon was going to solely attack Israel, but he was also going to use Babylon to punish even the Assyrians themselves for what they did in the Roman kingdom.
Did you say that when somebody's gonna use Babylon to,
To punish other nations, including Assyria.
and also the southern kingdom?
Yeah. We've got about 20 minutes, and we're probably going to need all of it to talk about Ezekiel. All right, so the first two prophets, they're long books, but they're again approachable within reason. Then we get to Ezekiel, and I'm not going to say that Ezekiel is unapproachable. Okay, I know a lot of people have tried to make books like Ezekiel or Revelation out to be something that the average person cannot understand, but that is not how the Bible is written. You have to understand that the Bible was always written for the common person. Okay? Now, that being said, averages are just that, averages, right? So certain things are going to come easier to people because they're above average, and there's going to be certain things that come harder for people because they're below average, and that's what creates an average, right? And so I'm not going to tell you that you're going to be able to just walk up to a book like Ezekiel and it just make total sense, but it's not a book we have to be afraid of. It's not a book that we have to, immediately think that I can't understand it, because basically there'd be no point for God to write a book that he didn't think a majority of the people could understand. Now, one of the big challenges we have, especially with some of these books, and especially Old Testament books, is things like time, culture, and language all kind of can get in our way, but it's not something that's insurmountable. We just have to understand what the challenges are and what we can use from the standpoint of tools or approaches in order to help ourselves understand. There's no hack to understanding the Bible. Okay, I know our current culture, everybody's like, "Oh, I've got a hack for this. There's no hacks for this. Okay, it's just about taking our time and utilizing tools and approaches. But the tools aren't hacks either; they're tools. In the same way that a hammer can be a very important tool in the hands of a well-trained framer or carpenter, and can be an absolute menace in the hands of somebody else. But it's the same tool. And so Ezekiel does present some challenges, even as the very first thing Ezekiel opens with is this vision, a very overwhelming vision of these four living beings, and kind of sets the tone for the rest of the book. But Ezekiel's, again, operating somewhat at the same time as Jeremiah, but Ezekiel is operating in Babylon. He is one of the captives. and his work is among the captives. And so in that way, Ezekiel is not only contemporary with Jeremiah, but he's also contemporary with Daniel, but where Daniel was with the kings of Babylon and so on, Ezekiel was down amongst the people, if you will. One of the big things that happens in the book of Ezekiel is the fall of Jerusalem. So Ezekiel was taken in one of the earlier, remember that I said there was about 20 years in 3 waves, the third wave being the final fall of Jerusalem. And Ezekiel was taken into captivity previous to that, but probably in the second wave, because the first wave was primarily men and women like Daniel who were taken and kind of put through this Babylonian school, if you will. And Ezekiel does not seem to have been put into that, and so that kind of makes me think that he's second wave. But he is already in Babylon when Jerusalem falls, and he foretells the fall of Jerusalem to the people there, who again refuse to believe his message. That's going to be a common theme for all of the prophets, is that for the most part, their message is rejected. That's why at times God had to send 4 or 5 of them at a time. And unfortunately, people still didn't listen. So again, the argument, even as Jesus kind of puts it to rest, the argument that, well, if I have one more miracle, or if somebody told me directly, nope. I can give you plenty of evidence that shows the amount of miracles or being told directly by God, or even receiving a vision from God, didn't stop some people from doing what they wanted to do anyways. That being said, Ezekiel primarily was working with the people, trying to help them deal with the idea of captivity. There are some messianic references in the book, but by and large, Ezekiel is a book written to show the people that God was still with them, even though they were in captivity, and especially after the fall of Jerusalem, that God had not completely forsaken them, but that they had brought this punishment upon themselves, and they were going to have to get through this, and God was would bring them back. Okay, so we don't really know very much about Ezekiel except for what we see in the book. We do know that he was married. Unfortunately, again, one of those kind of he was a very physical creature. That is, God often gave Ezekiel physical tasks to perform as part of his prophecies. And unfortunately, one of those physical tasks was to deal with the loss of his wife. His wife died the day Jerusalem fell. And so, again, Ezekiel was tasked with some difficult things, not only difficult messages, but kind of not unlike Jeremiah and some of the other prophets, also difficult things in his personal life to have to deal with. Ezekiel is a relatively long book, although comparatively to men like Jeremiah and Isaiah, Ezekiel seems to have only operated for a relatively short period of time, of a little over 20 years. But we are told that he is a priest, a preacher, and a prophet. It's kind of sad how much of the book of Ezekiel is put, how much Ezekiel had to tell people in captivity that it was their fault. What I mean by that is, you would think that, again, all of the prophets that had come before, even as we looked at Isaiah and some of those others that I mentioned being contemporary with Isaiah, they were all warning Israel, if you continue down this path, this is what's going to happen. Then it happens, they're taken into captivity, Jerusalem is besieged, eventually it falls, it's literally taken apart, And yet Ezekiel is still having to spend a lot of time, and God is having to expend a lot of time and prophecies and energy to tell them that it's their fault. Because even a lot of times, as you know, you're human beings, you know, even when the evidence of something being our own fault is right in front of us, we often still want to deny our guilt. And so that's what we see a lot of Ezekiel doing. So when we approach the book of Ezekiel, we do have to approach it a little bit different than other books of prophecy because Ezekiel is written differently. Ezekiel is written in what's called apocalyptic language. Now, the term apocalypse or apocalyptic comes from the Greek, but this style of writing predates the Greeks by a long shot. Okay, remember, he's working and writing roughly in about 600 to 575, give or take, okay, BC. The Greeks didn't rise to power until about 300 BC. So obviously this type of language, even though we often refer to it as apocalyptic, and that's a term taken from the Greek, this was actually a fairly common style of writing for the time and for the region. And so when we look at these things, apocalyptic language has to be taken a little bit different. As I mentioned, we can't necessarily take any prophecy 100% at face value, but other prophecy we can kind of approach it going, okay, there might be some poetic license used here, but for the most part, God is being pretty straightforward in what he has to say. With apocalyptic language and apocalyptic visions, it's almost exactly opposite. We have to approach it going, almost none of this is to be taken literally unless God specifically spells something out for us. And if we do that, we're going to have way fewer problems with Ezekiel and Daniel and the book of Revelation, because that's how it was meant to be used. Again, especially Ezekiel's visions and things were intentionally very vivid and overpowering. I think one of the best kind of modern analogies for this is kind of some of these modern action movies, especially as things like computer graphics and things have gotten so good and so computers have gotten so powerful to create things that at times when you watch some of these movies, there is so much going on the screen, there's absolutely no way that you can see everything. There's so many little things happening in all sections of the screen that there's no way that you can actually put your attention on everything all at one time. And often it requires either your attention specifically being brought to something, or for our modern movies, maybe watching it a second, third, 12th time. Okay, but again, this is intentional. This is what apocalyptic visions, apocalyptic language is about. It's about being overwhelming. It's about trying to demonstrate whatever it is that God is trying to demonstrate, whatever truth he's trying to get across. It's about trying to do that in a way that grabs your attention and holds it until God makes his point. Okay? Nobody really watches action movies, for example, for the plots, right? We watch it for the action. That's the whole point of it. Well, apocalyptic language and apocalyptic visions are kind of the same thing. It's attention grabbing so that then God can push his point into it. And again, it's a tactic that God uses. Well, as I mentioned with both Isaiah and Jeremiah, largely the straightforward talking was rejected. And so, to an extent, God then tries something different. Unfortunately, it's still rejected. Ezekiel is often mocked and treated poorly for some of the things that he does. And especially his prophecies regarding Jerusalem are essentially completely dismissed until that last wave of captives comes from Jerusalem and confirms what Isaiah had, or what Ezekiel had told them, that the city has fallen, the temple is destroyed, there's nothing left. And again, it's just kind of sad commentary on how much we want to reject God's message sometimes. In the comments here, Bill says their culture seems to have been entrenched in an attitude that God will always rescue them from attackers. And yes, and I want to, I guess, to address that, I don't want to make it seem as though that's incorrect, because God told them over and over again in Psalms and in prophecies and things that he would protect Israel. But there was always a caveat attached to that. Whether it was the prophecy given to David about his throne, that it would always endure. But if David's lineage wanted to see prosperity, and if they wanted to have protection of God, they had to walk in his ways. The same thing goes for Israel. We can go all the way back to the book of Leviticus, and God speaks of blessings upon blessings if they're faithful. But he also talked about curses upon curses if they became unfaithful. And so they did have every reason to believe that God would rescue them. I mean, look at the Judges and look at the, some of these other things. God often did rescue Israel from themselves, whether, we maybe think he should have or not. But it's, what they seem to miss is that God does a lot of things because he's God. That is, he sometimes blesses people just because he's God and he just can't help himself but from blessing people. But they often misunderstood that, for example, God not sending a 40-year famine meant, oh, he must be okay with what we're doing. No, he's still mad at what you're doing. He's still very upset with the way that you're living your lives and the way that you as a nation are going about things. But God's not one that's going to punish every single person in Israel just because the majority are unfaithful. And if you send a 40-year famine, you're essentially going to kill off everybody, including the righteous. And God's not that. He's not going to do that. And so, yeah, they kind of had this warped idea. And again, what's interesting is people have this same warped idea of God today, right? It's where you get these doctrines of everybody's going to be in heaven, or the once saved, always saved, or some of these doctrines about election and how you can't resist God, or sadly even maybe that you don't even have a chance with God. It's the same kind of skewed attitude that I'm gonna see God how I want to see God, and I'm gonna make God out to be the God that I think he should be, instead of actually looking and listening to what God is doing and saying. And yeah, Ezekiel, like these other prophets, is tasked with trying to open the eyes of the people. And again, he does so in, yes, some difficult to understand ways, but also if we give Ezekiel a chance, it's astoundingly beautiful. Okay? And when I say that, we have to remember that as amazing and awe-inspiring and maybe even overwhelming as the descriptions that Ezekiel gives us in his book in regards to some of these things, including he sees the throne room of God, and as I mentioned, the book opens with this vision of these beasts and they're have these kind of crazy descriptions. Remember, Ezekiel is trying his best to describe these things, but I'm going to tell you, let your imagination run wild as you read these descriptions. However crazy you think it is, it's probably not the half of it. And Ezekiel would just has to try to put something on paper so that we can at least try to understand what he was showing. And so when we look at apocalyptic literature like this, like sections of Daniel, like the book of Revelation, not only do we need to understand that it is vivid for the point of making the point, but we need to let ourselves get lost in the vision. As we read this, I would encourage you, don't stop every verse and try to analyze it. That's not how these visions work. Not everything in these visions, or Daniel's visions, or the book of Revelation, not everything is important. That is, not everything itself is some sort of major theological point. Sometimes it's just something that they saw, so they tried to describe it. In the same way that if you tried to describe an action scene from your favorite movie, you're going to have to pick and choose. Maybe there's a part of that action scene that you really think is neat, but somebody else watching the same scene wouldn't have even bothered to describe that. Okay? What we have to remember is that we're getting Ezekiel's version of the vision. We're not getting the actual vision, obviously, because God's not beaming it into our brains, directly. And so, don't think the worst thing that we can do for, especially these prophetic visions like those found in Ezekiel and things, the worst thing that we can do, kind of like with the Psalms, is try to overanalyze. Just let the vision kind of wash over you, and then wait for God to make his point, because he does make his point. And it's not usually a multifaceted point, it's usually one point, like, you did this, or I'm going to win. Okay? And so I think, again, in talking about some of the tools and approaches, they become extremely important when we talk about Ezekiel, Daniel, Revelation, etc. Okay, but we're going to have to pause there, and we'll talk a little bit more about those tools and approaches, Lord willing, next week. Because again, Ezekiel and Daniel being back to back, it is important that we kind of have an idea on what to do with these books. And really the same thing goes for Revelation, that's why I keep mentioning it this way. So, all right. Well, I thank you for your attention, and I hope that I didn't go too fast, but again, I'm trying to not get overly bogged down, because ideally, Lord willing, we're going to have time to go over these books in detail together. So I just want to kind of whet your appetite, encourage you to read these books, don't be afraid of them, and kind of give you some basis for your approach, with the idea that in the future at some point we'll dive deeper together. All right. Well, Nick, could I ask you to come up and lead us in a prayer? Sure.
So we have a lot of members that are in special need. Keep them in your prayers. Mark's mom, Elena's son had a biopsy. I don't know how that turned out yet, but he had a biopsy. And Gary and Dottie, he's going to already started his treatment. Bub and Sharon, he had a CAT scan, and then they're going to try and figure out how they should proceed with surgery. And then Pat, who's got Pat on his pearls just because. And we're going to keep blessing her family and our prayers as she tries to plan a memorial service for Betty. So we're going to keep blessing our prayers. And she has some other family issues going on. And then Linda couldn't make it here, so I'm going to return her pearls as an honorable mention. Clerks are traveling. The Wood family's traveling. So join me in the word of prayer. Gracious and Heavenly Father, we're so humbled to be able to study your holy word. This time we just pray that you extend merciful hand to all those on the prayer list, those that are in special need, and then those that aren't on the prayer list that are in special need. This time I pray that you be all the troubles going on throughout the world, Middle East, and Russia, Ukraine, and there's just so many things going on with China, Taiwan, and just there's so much saber rattling going on. I just pray that cooler heads will prevail. Pray that you be with our first responders, military forces, and all those to keep us safe. Make this evening possible. Please be with each and every one of us and keep us safe until we assemble again. We pray this in your son's holy name.